Do Mercedes diesel engines really last for 1,000,000 miles? This is a common statement. What are the statements? This is the 1,000,000-mile engine, referring to the Mercedes OM 615, 616, and 617. This car will last for 500,000 miles, usually referring to the 123, 126, 116, or sometimes even the 115 series turbo diesels. But where did the origins of this statement come from, and are they really true? I know for a fact that these engines will last for a long time, but are people really putting 500,000 miles on a Mercedes diesel engine today? This idea was born out of necessity. Oftentimes people from not so great countries that were often run by communist idiots that like to kill people, or countries that just couldn't get their act together, like the one that I happen to be from, Lebanon, which is going through a major financial crisis at the moment, would immigrate during the 60s, 70s, and 80s into more solvent Western European nations that happen to have more stable economies and greater economic opportunity. Often families would immigrate at a time, and sometimes three male relatives would pool their resources together to buy a Mercedes 110, 115, or 123 series diesel. These were often base spec cars like a 200D that were stick shift and rarely had power steering, and they'd slap a taxi sign on them and get their taxi registration and drive the car around the clock, usually in 3 8-hour shifts. And if one of the brothers or cousins was down, fine, 2 12-hour shifts, whatever, no big deal. But they'd pool their money and they'd use this one Mercedes diesel to support their family. And these cars often only got shut off to change the oil or to maybe replace a belt. Yes, they had one belt. And if major engine work was needed, you could use the Greek taxi driver model where everybody would take one day off and drink some ouzo and eat some spanakopita and some baklava and drink more ouzo, while the local Mercedes mechanic, who really did not charge that much at the time because these cars were in use everywhere, would swap in another engine that the brothers happened to acquire that needed a rebuild, that was rebuilt over the last few months, and just exchange the motor and get the thing going again within a day. This was entirely possible when you don't have things like power steering or air conditioning, other pointless consumers on the engine to worry about. You just make sure the alternator's on and working and the fuel tank has diesel in it, and maybe set the valve lash if things were slow at the airport, and just get that show back on the road. And when I was in Lebanon, this is very much the case. The 115 and 123 cars, which this is a well-known fact, but in Lebanon, gas cars are the only cars that are allowed, the only passenger cars allowed. So if you want to bring a diesel in, it means that you have to bribe someone. So that even the gas Mercedes, like the 200 or 234-4, were running around like crazy. And these cars were often never shut off. They were just driven and driven and driven and driven and driven, usually by multiple members of the same family. Whether they were in the taxi business or not, multiple family members would share one of these cars. And if you go into the Palestinian refugee camps, they're still sharing these cars, because when you're a Palestinian refugee and you don't have a lot of money, the 123 is your best friend. The oil changes are optional. So under these dire circumstances, the cars do seem to last for an extremely long time. The thing is that if you don't religiously change your oil or adjust your valves, engines do approach critical wear limits, and then sometimes you'll have a failure. And the failure will usually involve a crankshaft bearing or a rod bearing or a scored crankshaft or a bad oil pump or a broken timing chain. And in the United States, because people are averse to doing any sort of work and they take stuff for granted, unlike the people in these other countries, this is like the end of the road. Oh, I got to sell the car. Oh, it's going to cost too much to fix. So I'm going to have to go buy a new Honda. And really, I don't I don't know. I don't personally like the idea of just replacing your car because one thing breaks, because it's a lot of money to fix, because you can amortize the next car through a bunch of car payments. When you're living in a Palestinian refugee camp in South Lebanon, you don't have that option. So you and your friends pull the motor out. You go to the machinist who gets the crank good enough, and then puts bearings in it, and then sends you on your way to go put your engine back in your car. And it might run with slightly low oil pressure, but hey, it's running. The idea, though, that these engines last as long as they do, I think, was born out of a need by many people in Western society to quantify everything. And it's not good enough to say it'll last multiple lifetimes. They have to say 500,000 miles. Well, most of us are not going to put 500,000 miles in an older Mercedes diesel because, let's face it, these cars are often second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th cars. People have them because they like them and enjoy them. There are people who drive them every day in a lot of places, who use them maybe to drive from Virginia to Montana and back a few times a year or a month. But for the most part, people have multiple fleets of these things. And most people who do have these cars nowadays either take care of them themselves or, they repair them as needed. And so there is this idea of like a limit, the 500,000 mile mark being when I can't afford to repair the car anymore. I personally think they last a lot longer than that. But when you get to 500, 750, 800, 900,000 miles, maybe it's time to pull your engine and refresh your engine and replace things like pistons, rod bearings, timing chain parts, cylinder liners, valves and valve guides, camshafts. Maybe you get the idea. These wear parts to the engine are still going to wear out at some point, even when you try to even when you do your best to take care of them. And there was this idea that the Volvo 240 was just as long-lived as a car. Well, it's not that the Volvo 240 lasts longer. It's that the Volvo 240 had fewer heavy-duty items on it that could fail. And most Volvo 240s aren't going to get 500,000 or 600,000 miles on them without pulling a head or replacing a timing belt or, maybe pulling the oil pan and doing a set of bearings. I personally think that a lot of cars will achieve this kind of mileage. It's just that the car often falls apart around the engine, and that's the case with older Mercedes too. That's why there's a dearth of good Mercedes engines, but not that many great 123 or 115 series cars. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and think about subscribing. If you have an older Mercedes, remember that there's no such thing as too much mileage in a car. You can enjoy these cars well past 400, 500, 600,000 miles. Just be prepared to do some repairs. Some of them might be expensive, but still less expensive than, say, going out and buying a new Hyundai. I'll see you guys in the next video.